Right then, folks, thank you for coming and welcome to this webinar, Mastering the Migration to Azure Virtual Desktop, Expert Tips and Tricks. My name is Martin. I'm the Marketing Event Manager from Transparity. Just as a note, this event is being recorded. So the event will be recorded and shared on our website for public viewing. If you do not wish for your audio to be used in the recording, please stay muted and ask questions in the chat. We are monitoring the chat and questions will be raised. Thank you, and we hope you enjoy today's event. So just as a introduction to Transparity, before we dive in, we'll introduce you to us as a company. So at Transparity, we're a Microsoft pure play partner at the forefront of the latest technology, with one simple goal to help you make the most of your cloud investment in a way that truly benefits your organization. Our name stands for transformation, partnership, and clarity, three values that define everything we do. We're not just about technology, we're about working alongside you to drive meaningful business transformation. Through strategic planning, design, and implementation, we enable a business to streamline operations, enhance communication, and improve collaboration. As a testament to our commitment and excellence, we hold all 6 Microsoft partner designations, Azure Expert, MSP status, and several of Microsoft Advanced specializations awarded only to partners with the highest levels of competency and proven excellence. Without any further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Ant, who's going to be leading today's session. Please do place any questions you have in the chat, and we'll make time to answer them throughout the presentation. Over to you, Ant.
Thank you, Martin. Yeah, welcome everyone and to this Mastering the Migration of Azure Virtual Desktop. I'm Anthony Cook. I'm the head of practice for the Azure practice here at Transparity. The focus for this session is, first of all, an overview of what Azure Virtual Desktop is and its use cases. We've done webinars on this subject previously, but today I want to have more of a focus on the migration, the process of migrating, and some tips and tricks during that migration process. What I also want to do at the end is a bit of a demo, more of a demo around the service itself. But what I hope is that whether you're already using Azure Virtual Desktop now within your business or you're thinking about migrating, that you will still get value out of today's session, because I will talk about the migration process, but I will also share some tricks around actually managing the solution as we go through the session. So first of all, what is Azure Virtual Desktop? It's a desktop and app virtualization service similar to RDS, Citrix, VMware Horizon, for example. There's many others out there. It runs completely in the Azure public cloud. You can actually run this locally on what's now known as Azure Local if you wish, but predominantly this is something that's run from Azure public cloud, and because of that you get a lot of benefits from it, which I'll talk about. One of which is providing the ability for your users to work anywhere in the world from almost any device. You can use single session, which I'll show you, to assign devices to a single user, ownership over specific apps, for example, or you can benefit from multi-session, Windows 10 and Windows 11 multi-session, which again, I'll talk about a little bit more in the session, but that is one way, by the way, in which you can, first of all, optimize for costs. You reduce management overhead. So one of the biggest selling points to migrating, for example, something like RDS or Citrix, is that when you're managing Azure Virtual Desktop, you're only really managing session hosts, users, and images. There's no connection brokers, there's no licensing, there's nothing like that to deal with. That's super messy. Microsoft manage most of that for you, and I've got a little image to show you that. You can install your line of business apps really from anywhere, including Win32, MSIX, and AppX as well. And it's no longer a new feature, but a feature that came out last year was the ability to auto scale, which again is great functionality in terms of saving costs. Again, that's actually something I'll show you how we set that up. So as an overview, it's a virtualization service for desktops and apps. Can deliver Windows 10, 11, or Server, Server 2016 onwards, and all operating systems need to be 64-bit. You can deploy and scale in minutes for a simple Azure Virtual Desktop environment that includes a Windows 11 operating system with some Office apps. Realistically, if you have the licensing in place, it's something that you could deploy and be testing within a matter of 30 minutes. I'll actually show you that. You can use existing licensing. Costs for this service come from two different areas. First one being licensing. If you've got E3, E5, F3, Business Premium, your users are already licensed for this service. The other side to that costing is the session hosts themselves, but super predictable costs. And again, a lot of businesses we work with are already actually licensed for this service. Bring your own image. We're going to talk about this a lot in this webinar, because when we talk about migrating to Azure Virtual Desktop, what we really mean there really is an image, and what's on that image, what are those applications. You can provide personal ownership, as I mentioned, by those personal desktops. You don't have to have machines that are shared. But at the same time as well, if you are pooling users, we can use FS logics to make sure that profiles follow the users wherever they go. So it's the same experience regardless of what machine they're logged onto, or even the method to connect, for example. I will show you today in Google Chrome, any HTML5 browser. I believe you can do it on a watch if you wanted to. But the point is that you can run this really from anywhere on any device, and it will look and it should feel the same. An extra benefit, something which is, again, fairly new, but the ability to manage them via Intune. So if you're doing that at the moment, the way to secure and manage your AVD VMs with policy and apps at scale, just treat them like any other client within your environment. So loads of compatibility, really easy to set up, utilize those existing licensing, and again, connect from anywhere. There's some obvious use cases for this service, and it was actually released around the time of COVID, which obviously wasn't planned by Microsoft, but it was quite fitting actually. So when it was first released, this is something that we was working on weekly. Azure Virtual Desktop is still probably present in around 50% of the migrations we do. So when we pick up a customer's full estate, there's usually VDI solutions in there, and more often than not, we would move it to AVD. But providing the user's ability to work from their own devices is an obvious one. For example, working from home, and again, COVID. It's a really simple migration process. I say simple, depending on what's on the images and your apps you're using, but most of the time it's a fairly simple migration, or at least very easy to test and create a proof of concept. VMware Horizon is end of life. So that's an obvious use case, and something that we've also seen customers doing is, they need to move off of Horizon now. Where can you go? And Azure Virtual Desktop has been an obvious candidate for that. Reducing management overhead is something that we talk about as a Microsoft partner probably all the time when we speak about a lot of the services in Azure. And for the very reason to even migrate to the cloud in the first place, one of the main reasons is you have the ability to implement things in a way that it reduces management overhead. And again, with Azure Virtual Desktop, because you're managing really just the users and the images, it's likely you reduce that management overhead here as well. It's worth saying, however, that, for example, Citrix have a cloud offering. Their cloud offering also reduces some of the management overhead. So I want to be fair in terms of when I'm comparing products here, but in terms of traditional kind of Citrix environment, you will definitely have reduced management overhead. Excuse me. You may have a requirement to run security or regulation type applications. Maybe you're in financial services or healthcare and government. The ability to possibly allow for an elastic workforce. Maybe you have a contractor who you want to provide temporary access to your resources from their own device, for example. Temporary workers is also an obvious choice for something like this. But where we've also seen it is in areas such as design, engineering, and financial apps. So specialized applications. And I'm actually I'll give an example later on in the webinar where something wasn't a good fit for AVD, because again, I think it's fair to be honest about AVD and where its limitations are. But again, financial apps specifically, we see a lot of that. So before we talk about migration, the kind of final slide really, and this is just to push my point around the fact that there's less management overhead. Traditionally, in an RDS solution, for example, everything on the screen really would be managed by you. There would be diagnostics and load balancing and gateways, but as you can see, Microsoft manage a significant portion of that now. You will manage the session hosts, manage the images, and of course manage the users. But after that point, after it's been set up, if you have a fairly static workforce and fairly static applications, for example, management overhead should result in just adding users, patching machines, backups, and things like that. So it's not the greatest slide in the world, I'm not going to lie, but what I wanted to show here was that yes, we've worked with businesses that want to migrate to Azure Virtual Desktop, whether that's from Citrix, from RDS, and especially recently Horizon. When we talk about migrations, regardless of VDI solutions, most people think migrations of picking something up from where it is and moving it into Azure, for example. So a common thing we would do there is if you're running a Citrix environment, we would take the image that you're using at the moment, or likely to be multiple images, and move that into Azure, and then use that for the session hosts in Azure Virtual Desktop. More commonly, though, it's a rebuild. The most common migration path isn't to move it across. It's often, let's take this moment to start afresh, review the applications, create a new gold image. And that's the way that we see more often. But again, there may be various business reasons why that wouldn't work for you, and therefore you may be looking to move the image over. We work a lot in Azure Virtual Desktop as just a greenfield proof of concept type project, super common. So we don't even care what the kind of VDI solution you may have, and you may not even have one. Another route, which is common, especially as you first start to kind of use Azure Virtual Desktop, is more of a hybrid solution. So we will commonly see customers, for example, using Citrix, interested in Azure Virtual Desktop. Let's create a proof of concept side by side, have the systems working at the same time. If there's any issues, they can quickly move back to their original. And again, that's something that we see more often at the start of the journey. But there are some businesses out there that will consistently run a hybrid type of solution where maybe they're using AVD for those temp contractors, those temp employees, because it's great, it's fast to spin up, and then maybe they're using another solution for their normal employees. But it's more common than you think in terms of businesses using hybrids of the solutions, especially early on. So this is high level of the process, and I'm going to walk you through an example. The first part of this, of course, is assess and plan, as is with any migration. But when we talk about assess and plan, what we're assessing there is what are the applications, what are the images that you're currently using, what's your user base, and where are they? And a really important one is this notion of personas. So you may have someone that's working in finance that needs access to very different applications, say someone working in sales, for example. And one of my tips would be to really understand your different personas within your business and the different applications they use, because that in the end essentially becomes the image, the image that has those applications that then you can deploy to these different users. So my first tip would be understand it, not from a technology standpoint, but from the different use cases within the business and the different personas. Another obvious area for assessment would be, of course, licensing. Do you have the licensing currently or not? one thing to bear in mind when I spoke about licenses a little earlier, you can license this for external users. So if you're internally users working for your business, you're going to use Microsoft licensing, but there is an option to have a pay per user license, which you can have for external users as well. So again, if you've got some temp contractor coming in, need to give them access to a machine really quickly, buy the temp license, pay on a monthly rate. And once they leave, that cost drops off. This stage is also about planning. With something like Azure Virtual Desktop, it's very similar to kind of modern workplace type projects where, this is going to affect end users. This isn't moving a web server or a SQL server where you hope the users don't see the change. Your users are going to see the change. So it's important to plan for that. Who are the pilot users? What would the testing look like, for example? Now, the second one along is very, very common, but we don't see it with every project, but it's really common because it's so quick to get going and actually get a proof of concept up and running. It's really common that we'll go and do a proof of concept for maybe a subset of the users, one of the personas where they've got more simplified applications, for example. And by doing that, we can test the applications. We can also test latency. So obviously, AVD is hosted in the cloud, which is great because it means you can access it from anywhere in the world. However, you are adding substantially more hops networking-wise. So there is latency, and there are things you can use from Microsoft to test that. But if you think financial businesses, for example, latency can be extremely important. So it is something to be aware of. And if you are latency sensitive, that the proof of concept needs to be done to test that before going forward. We'd also use a proof of concept to just check sizing, storage sizing, session host sizing, monitor what's going off when those machines add more and more users, start to do some testing around various applications, for example. Does Teams video work to the standard that you expect? Those type of tests. And then from there, as with anything in Azure, especially infrastructure based, we would start to build those foundations. We would build the identity. Maybe there's specific AD groups that we want to build for the users. We create the resource groups, we create the subscriptions, the session hosts, all of the networking, for example. 95% of the build is actually done at this point. In terms of the landing zone and getting everything ready. The final stage is actually migrating users over to Azure Virtual Desktop, and Microsoft recommend a persona-based iteration, which is exactly what we do. Going back to the first box, breaking up people into personas. The personas have specific apps they need. Therefore, those personas have an image, what their apps are on. And then when it comes to migration, you want to migrate personas at a time. You don't want to be doing 3 people from finance, 2 people from sales. Keep it to one image, test it for a few days, move on to the next persona group, for example. I don't want to go too technical within this webinar, but of course, there's other things involved in migration, data movement, for example. They may have roaming profiles, which is likely. They may need data migrating into Azure for that. And then most importantly is the post-deployment testing. I'm going to be super honest on this webinar, and one of my tips and tricks at the end is test and test very, very well. Being able to log on to the desktop, send a message over Teams, open Sage, I don't know, yeah, that's great. But as with any VDI solution, and it's running on any hardware really, they can sometimes be small issues, odd things that can happen. So, and that's me being honest. And so if you are ever running a proof of concept or doing testing, test everything. And we have quite a big list of those type of tests, but even as simple as just navigating around the screen, opening a browser using a back button, just Yeah, test before it goes live. Along the bottom there is actually taken from the cloud adoption framework, but again, I could say this about any migration. We're going through that flow there of planning, proof of concept, foundations, and migrate. But throughout that whole process, there will be optimizations, costing, for example. There will be governance. Does that data need to remain in this country? Likely it does. So we think about that as we're doing this. Of course, everything is secure by design. And we also think about the management of these resources as well. So if I kind of double click into that screen and go through an example of how this could look, and then I'll give an example of where it didn't go well. You have a customer, or we have a customer, they're currently using Citrix, they're looking to migrate to AVD. They've got 300 users and they are UK based. Microsoft Office, of course, fairly standard, plus around 25 line of business apps, which is quite high. That business has identified 9 different personas. Some of them are internal, some of them are external users, and some of them can use pooled machines, and some of them need personal machines. There are some cases where you may be using certain software, for example, that needs to write, say, to the C drive, where in those cases you won't really be able to pull those. You'll have to assign, for example, Anthony Cook will be assigned this machine and he will always get that machine. So then I can do what I want on there and it'll never be overwritten. There are latency sensitive apps, but no regional DR required. So just to be clear, you will select a region where you run Azure Virtual Desktop from, ideally the region closest to you for latency. You can replicate this across any region you want to and have DR ready in case one of your primary regions goes down. Backups, of course, and something we see more often, and again, because AVD's got the ability to benefit from scaling, it's only required 9 a.m. till 5 p.m. However, sometimes someone from sales might want to log in at 1 a.m. one Saturday. You know, again, that's quite common that businesses will say, it's unlikely anyone's going to log in between 9 and 5, but it'd be great if they could have the ability. The proof of concept there, we identify the apps and the personas. We identify the test users, proof of concept users, and we start to build out that proof of concept with that image that suits those personas. And importantly here, due to sensitivity of latency, we would test latency. And we would also, as I mentioned previously, have a look at the monitoring, have a look at the statistics. How is this system doing when it's got 5 people on? Because it's going to need to be scaled to 300 at some point. That's why the proof of concept is important, just to ensure that when you do release it, the users get the experience that they expect. The landing zone is fairly standard. I'm not going to spend too much time on that. The subscription will be created if needed. A resource group would be created, and some fairly basic networking is all you need. Actually, a single network and a subnet is all you need in Azure to make this system work. What I would say there is a business that need access to apps such as Word and Excel is very different to one that needs, for example, Sage. So you may be using applications that are connecting to back-end SQL servers. They may even need to connect back to on-premises for some reason. In that instance, the landing zone would likely include a VPN as well. So in its simplest form, in the form I show you today, it's just one network. But if you do have dependencies on your applications, it's not a problem, but it would just mean that networking will need to be a little more, slightly more complex when it comes to the landing zone side of things. And then it's the migrate, create the image based on the applications those personas need. When we talk about AVD migrations or AVD in general, and obviously I've spent a lot of time with the system, but really the complexity comes with images. You may bring your image from where it used to be from Citrix or RDS, that's fine. You may build one from scratch, that's fine. Or you may not have any complex requirements where you can use a marketplace image, which is exactly what I'll show you in the demo. So it's really dependent on your requirements, but I can't stress enough that the technical side of things on this migration is all about the image. Microsoft really manage everything else for you. You can see along the bottom a few things that I want to touch on. And again, if you're already using Azure Virtual Desktop at the moment, hopefully some of these things can help. Continuously optimize, view, monitor the workbooks that are available to you within the portal. Is the compute being configured too high? Is it configured too low? There's a balance there, obviously, of cost. There's other things you can use like scaling plans. So scale them up when it gets to 9 o'clock in the morning, scale them down at 5 p.m, for example. There's also, again, this has been around about a year. This customer here wants the machines to be switched off at 5 p.m. every day, but someone might want to log in. What you can do is you can enable something called Start on Connect. So it will switch them all off, so you're saving the cost. But if someone wants to get into an Excel spreadsheet at 3 o'clock in the morning, when that person goes to connect, it will automatically fire up that machine for them. So you can optimize costs while still delivering an experience to your users that they can access this whenever they want. There's additional pieces as well to saving costs in AVD. One example would be reserved instances. Anyone that's not familiar with them, when you buy compute or Azure virtual machines within Azure, you can apply what's called a reserved instance, where you are making a commitment for either 1 year, 3 year, or 5 years use. And by doing that commitment, you can see discounts, I believe, up to around 55%. One thing to be wary of that, if you're paying for a reserved instance, there's no point switching your machines on and off because you're paying a flat fee. So sometimes the calculation is, what do I save on buying a reserved instance? Let's say it's 50%, but if you can automate your machines on and off, and actually they're only online for 30% of the time, it's cheaper to go for a scaling plan instead of a reserved instance. There's no point combining the two. If you pay for an RI, you're paying for a flat rate no matter what, so leave the things on. Governance comes into play, of course, with anything in Azure, whether that's governance around any type of regulatory commitments, GDPR, ISO 27001, Cyber Essentials, using things like Azure policies to create guardrails to ensure that no one can move data where it shouldn't be, or no one can create a session host in a country where you're not actually registered, for example. So there's more to it than just the technical side. There is some governance layers that you can apply. And finally, management. Of course, as with any other service, you can monitor this natively. You can back up your file shares, and you can patch the machines all from a single pane of glass within the Azure portal. One time where this didn't go so well, and I want to share it just to make a point, especially around the latency. We were working with a business in the financial sector who was, I believe it was currency trading, hence why latency was so important. Before they spoke to us, every user, every trader was assigned an Alienware laptop, a beast of a laptop, a couple of grand, I believe. But they also had 6 4K monitors in the office, and they had a requirement to be able to use the Bloomberg keyboard, because again, they were trading. Now, 6 4K monitors on AVD, not a problem. However, to be able to power that and all the applications, and because of the applications these traders were using, they had to, first of all, have personal machines. They couldn't be pooled. They couldn't share multiple people on one. So we knew it was one-to-one. Also, huge graphics cards to run the monitors. But more importantly, after all of that, latency was too much of an issue. And in all honesty, I think latency alone would have been enough not to continue there. But it was actually cheaper to use the Alienware laptops than it was AVD. And that's a mega extreme example that Microsoft never want me to talk about, but you know, they have to be assigned one-to-one. They have to be able to use 6 4K monitors, super low latency. In that instance, AVD wasn't the right thing to use. Now that you can run it on Azure Local, maybe there's a business case for that now, because you can now run AVD locally. But yeah, that's just one example. I wanted to share that because the latency more often is the reason. It's actually cost is rarely the reason why a customer wouldn't go ahead with AVD, because actually compared to current setups, Citrix, and especially if you have the licensing, it would usually work out cheaper. But it'd be fair to share one where it didn't quite go too well. I've got some tips and tricks, and I'll talk over some of these actually when I go into the demo, but I mentioned it already. Split your using into personas, understand the personas and what they do, what the applications they need. If you can keep those images as tight as possible, where you only get what you need, the experience will be better in the long run. Create a proof of concept, understand the compute requirements, and get those detailed insights into things like sizing and costs. And as I mentioned, test, collect detailed feedback, especially if your users are all using different hardware, different browsers, for example, to access this. Don't just assume that if it works in one, it's going to work just as perfect in another. And utilize scaling plans and utilize Start on Connect. It's very rare a business will need all session hosts to be available 24/7. At the very least, you can use scaling where you're only providing the amount of compute was actually needed by your business. Remember, VMs are charged by the second, so if you can keep them shut down, it will dramatically reduce your costs. And implement some security best practices as well. I mean, I could put this in any webinar I've ever done, but utilize multi-factor where possible. You can use things like conditional access policies to limit where people are connecting to AVD from and things like that, for example. And what I've popped at the bottom there, just before we go into any questions in a demo, is it's all about the images. If you've got apps that aren't connecting to too much stuff, too many back-end services, it will be fairly simple. If you've got lots of apps and financial apps that need to connect to databases or speak to banking systems, for example, it's a little bit more complex. But either way, it can be done. If you are running workloads on a Windows OS right now, it can run in AVD. It's just around getting that compute and the latency right. Usually I would stop as I go through. I got into a bit of a flow there, so I'll stop and first of all just ask Martin, is there any questions in the chat, or is there any questions anyone would like to raise before I go into a demo?
So we've got no questions in the chat right now, Ant, but we can have more time after the demo. If anyone does want to raise anything, we'll have some more time then.
100%. Yeah, demo will take 5 or 10 minutes, and I'll leave some time at the end if anyone does have any question. Now I hope that the demo gods look down on me. Right. Azure Virtual Desktop, the name of the service. I've created a demo host pool, and I'm going to show you how to actually create that in terms of that simplicity and creating a proof of concept. A host pool is essentially a number of virtual machines, and they are the virtual machines that your users will connect to, whether they will connect to the same one every time because it's a personal, or they'll just be joining into a pool of them because it's a pooled environment. Host pools are essentially just Azure virtual machines with an agent installed on them that makes it think it's an AVD environment. Let's say right now you had users that was mostly only using Office apps. Everything else they access is through browsers. There's no applications installed. You could get something going fairly quickly. And I'll show you here. First of all, of course, a resource group, host pool name. It's a terrible name, but in terms of the demo, one thing to be aware of is this line here. When you select a location, it will tell you where your metadata is being stored. That's important. It didn't used to always be stored in the same location you installed AVD. Now that usually is, but it's something to be aware of, especially if you're regulated in any way. It's going to be a desktop app group. And here's where you select. Is this going to be a machine that only Anthony can join, or is this going to be a machine that anyone in the business can pull onto to optimize those costs? And another one which is important, especially if you're going to scale, let's say I'm going to pull this and I'm going to create 5 VMs. Do I want breadth first or depth first? So do I get everyone on one machine and then when that machine is full, move on to the next one? Or do I always equally spread users throughout? It's completely up to you how you want to do that. But you can have more benefits certain ways in terms of cost, which I'll show you. So let's say max session limit is going to be 5. And then it's as simple as adding a virtual machine. If anyone on this call's ever added a virtual machine in Azure before, it's essentially the same screen. It wants to know what the resource group is. You give it a name. Here you can see, is it an Azure local virtual machine? So are you running this on your own hardware locally? You can have availability zones, by the way. So if you've got multiple session hosts, which is likely, spread them across Microsoft data centers for obvious reasons. If you use availability zones, you will get 99.99% availability by spreading them over different data centers. And here I can select an image. So if I want something out of the marketplace and out of the box, Windows 11 with 365 apps, it'd be great. It'd be great for the personas. Excel's there. They've got PowerPoint and Word, and everything else is connected over the internet. Say I want 5 of those VMs. There's a bit of networking to do. So as I mentioned earlier on, the minimum is a single network. As you can see here, this will ask me to select that single network. And I can protect that network if I wish via network security groups. And then finally, the last important piece, how to connect these session hosts. So I have done it via Entra, which means the only way it's getting its identities for both the machine and the users is from Entra only. I have no domain controllers. I have no Entra ADDS involved here. This is pure Entra. And because of that, because I chose that option, I also, as you can see there, the ability to enroll this into Intune. So if I selected yes there, it will automatically do that based on my Entra tenant. So if I've got that enabled, it will enroll me into Intune automatically. And then, of course, it's things like administrator accounts. Now, a workspace is essentially a grouping of application groups. So it's a way of grouping certain things together. In this instance, I'm going to skip that. And then finally, I could click, yeah, let's add some diagnostic settings, for example. And then it'd be next and finish. And, you know, that would take 10 to 15 minutes to deploy. You'll be able to get a user logged in there to test those apps. I've made this seem very, very simple. In terms of proof of concept, in terms of getting something in front of your users, if you're not using any custom line of business apps, it is this simple. But that's very rare. Obviously, most businesses have got a lot of line of business applications that they need, but I just wanted to show you in terms of out of the box, it's a very simple solution to configure. There was no brokers involved there, or the only option around load balancing was a single question. But for the complex environment, before I'd get to this point, I'd be worried about the image. I'd be looking at creating that image. If I show you what a host pool looks like, so in Art Attack fashion, I've created one yesterday. As you can see here, this is a host pool that's based on desktops and pooled. So this is pooled. I can have however many people I want on these machines. There's currently 2 machines, both of which I can connect to. There's no active sessions at the moment, thankfully, and there shouldn't be. Some of the main areas to look at, and I've got some tips around some of these as well, is RDP properties. First of all, I'm using Entra single sign-on, which didn't used to be a function, but is now available. And you'll see that when I go to log in, it's using Entra single sign-on. You can change session behavior. Maybe you want an auto reconnect if a connection drops. Sounds great. You can do auto detects around bandwidth. You can compress a video if you wish as well. Usually the only one we often see used here is the reconnection. Where it's common though is things like device redirection. So where I mentioned earlier, for example, that the finance company needed to use the Bloomberg keyboards. that was fine because of things like redirection will enable to do that. So you can redirect printers, anything you expect normally from an RDP session. This is where you can enable the multiple displays. If you want those 6 displays running at 4K, you can do it. You can set it all in here, and you can be quite custom around how it looks visually when it's coming through, based on, for example, I've got double monitors and one of them's an ultra wide, so that can be quite useful for me. And finally, don't want to get too technical, but there are some advanced settings as well. So there are certain things that you can do and set that might not necessarily be in this list here, but it can still be done by adding things into this RDP properties. And for example, if anyone was interested, this one there enables me to use just be connected to Enter ID when I log in. If I didn't have that value there, when I go to log in, it will tell me my username and password is wrong. All it needed was that one line, and it would have allowed me through. So most of the configuration, once you've done the image of the actual sessions, is done through this here, the RDP properties. And then the second area of interest, and again, if you're looking to save costs possibly, is this screen. This is where you can enable Start VM on Connect, for example. This is where you can do that. You can change your load balancing algorithm, and you can change the session limits as well. So Start VM on Connect is done from there. One more things to show you in terms of tips. So here's the session hosts, host 0, host 1. If I view them through Azure Virtual Desktop, you will get this screen here. It's telling me that basically the agent's installed correctly. There's a couple of things I can do from this screen though if I wanted to. So if someone was logged in right now, I'd be able to see them. I could send them a message to let them know I'm going to boot them off in 10 minutes. Or you can force sign them out. Very similar to things like Citrix, those type of solutions. But it's worth noting, and the reason I show you this is an AVD session host, but if I click on it again, if I click on the name, it's just a virtual machine. Again, this is just a virtual machine that's backing this service. It's nothing more than that, a virtual machine with an agent installed. One other thing in terms of a tip really is you'll see here this option for a scaling plan. If I'm already in the session host, I can assign a scaling plan, but they need to be created first. So everyone's aware of this existing, I think it's probably older than 6 months, but we still see a lot of environments with it not being used. This is where, for example, the customer example I gave previously, where you could tell the AVD session host to scale up and scale down as needed. So, for example, you may have 100 users and you decide to have 10 users on each session host, so you're going to have 10 session hosts. So you may decide that at 8 a.m., 2 of them switch on. And then as users start to come in the office, as they start to fill up, start to activate the other ones. And as it gets quieter towards the end of the day, start to deactivate them as people leave the session host. And you can do that using a scaling plan. If I skip from this original screen where you essentially give it a name, just to show you how this works, you basically create a general. So what's its name? How often will this be repeated? Monday to Friday. What's the minimum percentage of hosts? So if I had those 10 hosts and I wanted always to a minimum of 2, I can put that 20%. And then I can set a minimum and a maximum size. And where the magic starts to happen and where you could start saving significant costs is tell it at 8 o'clock to start to build up the machines. And you could say to it, once the machine gets to 60% capacity, for example, start the next one. You can set peak hours in there, very similar. You can set the ramp down when it gets to 5 o'clock, 5:30, as people start to drop off, start to shut them down. And then, of course, you can set those off-peak hours as well, where you may have just no machines. But again, if you use this service along with Start on Connect, you will utilize costs, but still give everyone the ability to log in whenever they want. So it's always a really good pairing with those two. And finally, in terms of AVD, and I mentioned it earlier on, but if I'm on the Azure Virtual Desktop main screen that you can see here, yes, there's users where you can add users, but one of the things I just wanted to mention was that per user access pricing, the options down here, you have to switch it on, but that's where you'll find that option. So if you are looking to license someone that doesn't work for your business, that's where you go to do that. So yeah, AVD, really nice system, takes away all the management overhead or the majority of it. If you're migrating or if you're starting greenfield, the problem's still the same. Get the personas right and get the images right. Everything else will fall into place after that, he says. But it's a service that Microsoft are still investing in. Yes, there was another service called Windows 365 that Microsoft always offer, which is a simplified version of this and a way to provide desktops to your users. But you can't use Server OS on Windows 365, and you can't have the type of customization that you can get from AVD either. So if you were wondering around those two services, they're the main differences. If I go back, just wanted to share before I open up for any questions, if there are any. I just wanted to share that we have a free of charge 2-hour AVD workshop, right? We can talk about prereqs and your licensing. We can have a look at some of your applications and whether they have specific architectural requirements, for example. And we can even look at size and advice and cost predictions. And it doesn't necessarily have to be forced into that agenda, by the way. But if you want to have a chat with some experts around Azure Virtual Desktop, whether you're looking to migrate or you're looking to optimize what you already have, I believe there'll be something popped in the chat. That's right, Martin, isn't it? A link we've popped in or poll?
Yep, that's just popped up now.
Excellent, perfect timing. I'll leave that on the screen, but also yeah, ask if there's any questions from anyone. I assume there's none in the chat, Martin.
So we've just had a couple come in, so I'll just read those out. So the first question, so hardening the AVD platform would be done via Intune like you would with an Intune device. I'm thinking of stopping users copying data out, etc.
Yeah, but at the same time, there are some, so 100%, if you're using Intune now, use Intune for that. But if you remember when I shared the RDP properties screen, there's also things there where it'll stop copying and pasting between, say, the environments and stuff. But if you're using Intune, I would say to anyone that's got Intune, if you can go Enter ID, use Intune, because your workflow won't change, basically. Yeah.
Brilliant. And just one more here. So it's not really been covered, but what is your experience of getting legacy apps to work on AVD using AppAttach, for example? That's a big laugh from you there, Ant.
Yeah. The person that's asking the question is probably laughing as well. We've done a few projects. I think we've done 3 or 4 projects, right? Proof of concept all the way. We found some of them quite difficult, and others have worked really, really well. Microsoft have had a go a few times at providing us a way to turn apps and kind of virtualize them really easily. I can't remember the old name, like AppV or something, but it's worked very well in some instances, and in others it's been a little bit of difficulty. So what we've had to do is do it via the desktop. What I would say is get a proof of concept going as quick as you can on that. And that feels like a cop out of an answer, but that's without knowing why it's complex. I would say just get a test going as soon as you can, really. Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, that's all the questions from the chat. So thank you all very much for attending. If you can, take a look at the poll I've just put up, just asking you to give some feedback on today's session. And have we got another slide?
I think it's just it's a thank you. And thank you, anyone that's joined these webinars before and has seen me present before. I appreciate you coming again. And yeah, keep your eye out on the Transparency website, not just for webinars and events coming out of this practice, but we are super busy at the moment with webinars, and Martin and the rest of the marketing team. So go have a look at our website. There's a lot of interesting events coming up this year. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.